The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome to the bonus show. Let's start by talking about radiation. Radiation is an area where there has been pretty widely a sort of consensus around the linear relationship between radiation exposure and damage to human health. And the linear framing of radiation suggests that basically for each additional unit of radiation that a human is exposed to, in a linear sense, you are more at risk of health issues as a result of that radiation. And this is logical in many ways because we are aware of certain levels of radiation that are extraordinarily damaging and dangerous to human health. But there's a new sort of approach that suggests that the linear model may not be the best one. And the linear model has a few characteristics. One is, as I mentioned, that additional radiation is all equally more damaging as you are exposed to more and more radiation. And it includes the no amount is safe approach to radiation, which is that there is, you might not be, you could be exposed to a small amount of radiation, and it might be small enough that it won't end up being what kills you if your trajectory is for a longer life than the radiation would affect, but that any amount of radiation is unsafe to some degree. And basically, to explain the new idea is that when you account for all of the different types of radiation, including radiation that humans are exposed to coming out of the earth, that the linear model may simply not be accurate. The gist being there are some levels of some types of radiation which the body may be able to tolerate without negative consequences. Now, the question then becomes, when we're talking about the avoidable damaging types of radiation, I don't think it really changes the approach, Pat. I mean, like, if you determine that the health effects of radiation may not be linear, that doesn't make me say, well, now I'm going to not be that worried about being exposed to radiation. I still try to avoid exposure no matter what, I think.
Yeah, I actually recently saw this viral YouTube video of this guy who had like a radiation meter, and he was going around to different nuclear sites and testing the radiation levels.
Yep.
So he went to Chernobyl, where there was a disaster, 20, 30 years ago in Ukraine, and he tested the levels there. And he went to Hiroshima and a few other places. And, you know, progressively you see more and more levels of radiation. But then by the end of the video, he tests just like what the radiation levels are for smokers. And it was far beyond the radiation levels of people who live in Hiroshima or Chernobyl, these other places. And that was brand new news to me. Like, I didn't know that just smoking alone is something that's putting you at risk of radiation. And I think there's probably a bunch of other activities that we do as human beings that are exposing us as well that we don't even think about.
The idea that science, in addition to that being true, the idea that now is being sort of explored by science is that there are millions of years of evolution here on Earth. Of course, a couple 100,000 years as modern humans, and then a couple million years as early humans as well. And that at the genetic and cellular level, there are mechanisms that can neutralize or repair damage done by sort of low-grade radiation. And thus the gist is, again, that this linear model of no amount is safe may simply not be right. I wouldn't be acting on it in any way that makes me less worried about radiation right now, but the idea when it comes to the sort of economics around this is that some of these advocates say that we may be able to relax some of the restrictions on extremely low dose radiation that are out there. I'm not saying that this is the truth, to be very clear. I'm merely saying that this is the idea that one wing of radiation research is now saying. More good news to report. Earlier this week, I told you that Indonesia raised the minimum age for marriage in the country from 16 to 19. Saudi Arabia is lifting travel restrictions on women, which I know it sounds like, wow, how forward-thinking and enlightened. But listen, this is Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is now allowing women to travel without permission and also granting them more control over family matters, which is another little chip out of this extremely male-dominated, male guardianship sort of status quo that Saudi Arabia has been embroiled in. I don't know that they would use that word, for a very, very long time. And there's been a number of royal decrees stipulating that Saudi passports should be issued to any citizen that applies for it. that anyone over 21 does not need permission to travel. And these are, if you understand Saudi law and customs, directly related to laws around women's sovereignty over their own lives. The amendments also grant women the right to register childbirth, marriage, or divorce, and to be issued official family documents and be eligible as guardians to children who were minors, which previously defaulted to men and was available to women only with male permission. So, every time we do these stories, Pat, about women are going to be allowed to drive with male permission or whatever, they are advancements. And yet in the West, it often feels like, what are we really cheering here? We don't want to go overboard and praise a country for things that seem like they should have been dealt with decades or hundreds of years ago. But they are still advancements. And for that, we should be happy.
Yeah, it's kind of like when people in 2012 came out in support of gay marriage.
Yes.
At that time, you probably should have known better. You should have known that people of the same sex should be able to marry each other. But once people change their minds, you can't scold them and be like, "Oh, well, all along you weren't in support of gay marriage, so we don't support you. We were not going to move forward with you." You have to be able to move forward and encourage them to continue to make the right decisions going forward. And I think that's what you have here with Saudi Arabia making these changes. I also just wonder like what may have triggered them though too, because I don't know if it was like some sort of internal struggle or like internal politics with the kingdom. It certainly wasn't like any sort of foreign pressure. It's not as if like the West was hostile towards Saudi Arabia. The United States is still giving them this $500 billion arms deal, even after murdering a journalist and all the different crimes that they've committed. So it's like this wouldn't have resulted out of international pressure. I wonder what did it. Maybe it's just modernity.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I don't think it's crazy to think that this is a calculated PR move because of the Jamal Khashoggi stuff, because of all of the increased focus that there is in some circles, the Saudi war on Yemen, which has led to a humanitarian crisis and all these other things. I don't think it's overly cynical to think that that may be what is driving some of these reforms. Whatever is driving it, obviously we can say, listen, letting women get a passport without male permission does not in any way counteract the horrors of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and that would be correct. But we can still say that these are the right decisions, and to that extent, maybe we'll see more of them in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia upcoming. Let's talk a little bit about coal. There's a very interesting study which has found that pollution-linked deaths as a result of coal are decreasing significantly. And the reasons are very clear. In agriculture, the use of coal is decreasing. Power generation is seeing a decreased reliance on coal. Manufacturing is seeing a decreased reliance on coal. Transportation is seeing a decreased reliance on coal. And meanwhile, Donald Trump is still insisting on and trying to revitalize coal. Coal deserves to die. There are both immediate and longer-term benefits to getting off of coal, and this is a really great thing. The power sector is probably the biggest one, where coal being used to generate electricity has decreased the most out of all these areas. And this just reinforces a few things for me, Pat. Number one, as usual, Donald Trump's strategy is completely backwards, and we should be letting coal die. We should be even encouraging coal to die by subsidizing other industries that provide clean power. And number two, we are more than equipped to provide for our energy needs by starting to phase out some of these dirty forms of electricity, not all at once. I understand the reality of the amount of electricity and power that we need to generate, but we're in a position to do this and we should be doing it, and it's good for the environment and it's good for people.
Yeah, we understand that coal needs to die. There's so many different negative externalities as you lay out: the environment, people's health, it's dangerous, we don't need it, all that stuff. But like, I wonder why they won't let it die. I mean, I guess politicians, they have to appeal to the few coal miners that remain. So like Trump, he wants to win in West Virginia and he wants to win in Pennsylvania and he wants to win in Kentucky. So I kind of get that.
I
But
think
like
it's about the donors too, though.
Yeah, oh, well, that would make sense. But like even like individual coal miners, like it seems as if they have a lot of pride in the job. Maybe their parents did it and their grandparents did it, and they want to pass this sort of occupation down the line generationally. And I understand, like if it's hard work, then I'm sure you do take some pride in it. But why are you killing yourself over it? I mean, with all the stuff that you're exposing yourself to, I mean, you're not going to live as long and as healthy of a life as you otherwise would have. Like, what is driving that?
Listen, in some parts of the country where the coal jobs remain, there's very little else to do. I mean, there are towns in West Virginia that exist solely because of coal mining. And I don't begrudge any individual their decision to put themselves at physical risk because they need to put food on the table for their family. So that I actually do understand. The bigger issue for me is that this does seem to be significantly motivated by, number one, the fact that the coal industry donates a lot of money to elected officials. And as a result, they have a disproportionate amount of power, even though it's an industry that should be going away. And number two, there is something intangible about coal as sort of patriotic and American and reminiscent of the new frontier and manifest destiny during the early age of the United States that I think also is part of why so many Republicans are just in love with the idea of revitalizing coal, which quite frankly makes no sense whatsoever. But I think that that's part of what it is.
Yeah, and I wonder if the approach should be trying to just phase it out or if it should be outright banning it. Certainly, you don't really have the political capital now to just get rid of it altogether. But like we see where the trajectory is going. We've talked about how like there are fewer workers in the entire coal industry than there are at JCPenney.
Yes. And Arby's or something like that, isn't it also?
Yeah. Yeah, so when you lay it out like that, I mean, why do we have to, invest all this money into this dying industry? Why do we have to like placate to these people? Money is power. I mean, if they have the money, they can at least for the short term keep that industry alive.
And remember that any political decision that is made has an economic cost. We've talked about this, like if we had Medicare for all, there would be people who work in medical billing and other ancillary tasks whose services would no longer be needed. But you weigh the cost against the benefit, and you do away with the idea that political decisions can't have economic cost. Every political decision has some economic cost. It's not zero sum, though, and we have to look at whether the benefits outweigh the costs. And when it comes to something like coal mining, and you understand the small number of people employed in that industry, doesn't make their jobs or their livelihood any less important, but you consider the small number of people employed and the massive damage that coal does to the environment and pollution deaths and all of these other things, the benefits of letting coal die, you don't have to make it illegal even, but just letting coal die drastically outweigh the costs. And I think that this is yet another study that shows that. That does it for today. New week of shows and bonus shows next week.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.